The first dinosaurs of the mid-Triassic period were small, 1 to 2 meters in length. They were bipedal with their arms shorter than their legs, and they were relatively unspecialized, lacking the horns and armor, etc., that later groups would have. The earliest dinosaurs had a pubic bone which projected forwards, and this condition is known as the Saurischian hip, and this would typify the majority of the meat-eating theropods, with the exception of the later group which led to birds, where it would revert backwards, and then the long-necked sauropods. So these groups, whose later members were quite specialized and looked different from those early dinosaurs, they evolved from these basal dinosaurs. And by the end of the Triassic, the earliest ornithischian dinosaurs were known, in which the pubic bone was rotated backwards. Among other things, this could perhaps give more room for intestines, as this group specialized on eating plants. Since especially the first ones lacked the ability to chew, just perhaps a larger digestive tract allowed the ingested material to sit and ferment for longer periods of time. From these ornithischian dinosaurs would then evolve a number of groups, the armored dinosaurs being the first lineage to separate, and then the ornithopods, and then finally the groups which I'll mention today, a small group of dinosaurs known as the Pachycephalosaurs and the horned dinosaurs. Now, notice that the first dinosaurs were small, bipedal, and unspecialized. The earliest theropods and prosauropods, the earliest armored dinosaurs, ornithopods, and then horned dinosaurs were also relatively small, bipedal, and unspecialized. But just as those theropods and sauropods underwent changes, among the ornithischians, some became more top-heavy and became armored dinosaurs. Some would become ornithopods, which could be, bipedal or capable of both bipedal and quadrupedal locomotion. But then there were two groups, once again, the ones mentioned today, which developed a thickening in skull bones. One produced a dome of a skull, and the other would ultimately produce a bony frill and horns in many. And so the Pachycephalosaurs, the domed skull ones, and the horned dinosaurs, the ceratopsians, they are cousins in a sense, in that in the ornithischian lineage, the armored dinosaur branch diverged first, the ornithopod second, and then the horned dinosaurs and Pachycephalosaurs could be united into a group Marginocephalian. So the Pachycephalosaurs were bipedal, as were the first ornithischians and the first dinosaurs. They were herbivores. And perhaps their most noteworthy feature is the thickening of the skull to form a dome. Now, not all had this feature. So there were early ones which had more of a flatter skull. This group seemed to have evolved in Asia, as did all of the ornithischians. So, the early armored dinosaurs, all the early stegosaurs are known from Asia. The Protoceratopsians are known from Asia. So Asia seems to have been the birthplace of much of the ornithischian diversity, which then spread to other regions of the world. As we look at the Pachycephalosaurs, once again, some had a flatter skull, some could have bony spikes, some had a solid casing of bone. They could include very small members. Micropachycephalosaurus was very small, despite having what I think, last I checked, was the longest dinosaur name. And so there was a great diversity in these plant-eating bipedal organisms. The domes, it is thought, were useful for defense because there was a modification of the back of the skull, which aligned the skull to better absorb shock. Not only might this indicate that they were using this as a defense against, say, a potential predator, like a Tyrannosaurus, or a large theropod, but then also the fact that there were some indentations on some of these, suggesting that they had been used in ramming. Now, not only might this be used as defense, but if to make a modern comparison, in bighorn sheep around mating season, the males compete with each other by slamming their skulls together, and the indents which were seen on some of the skulls would be consistent with Pachycephalosaurs fighting among themselves. And so if you were to visit some of our great museums of natural history, so Philadelphia, New York, other places you could see Pachycephalosaurs, once again bipedal animals. Notice the pubic bone going backwards as in the ornithischian condition. Notice that there can be a thickening of the skull, there can be spikes, there can be both. So there were different types of Pachycephalosaurs here. Now, it could be thought that with such a large casing, with such a large dome skull, perhaps they have a larger brain and are more intelligent. But as you can see by the size of the brain, that is not the reason that the skull was enlarged. So this was just to make a case of bone. As some have argued that when they look at the Pachycephalosaur domes, that they see two different kind of morphs, one being a little bit bigger than the other, and perhaps representing a gender difference. And once again, if one of the reasons for this was for, say, males to fight with each other during courtship, then that would certainly be consistent with that. So this is a diverse group. There were some very small members. The presence of spikes or the dome could vary a bit. And like the horned dinosaurs we'll mention, the common ancestor of Pachycephalosaurs and the horned dinosaurs began thickening this region of the skull with the two different lineages, then took in different directions. The final group of dinosaurs I would like to mention are the horned dinosaurs. Now, once again, when looking at a horned dinosaur, this looks so different from those first dinosaurs, which were small and bipedal. Here we see, the large size, it's quadrupedal. It has this parrot-like, beak. That's a fairly thick mouth. There's no teeth in the front. There's a dental battery here to help slice food. Obviously there are horns. This frill, it's of note, there are openings here for jaw muscles. That will, I'll mention that again in a second. And so one could obviously ask, where did this group come from? Well, that's an important point when we study dinosaurs. The Mesozoic era started 250 million years ago, ended 65 million years ago. So dinosaurs were around for an enormous length of time, but not all of the dinosaur groups were known from that entire period. So the Pachycephalosaurs, they were known from the Cretaceous period, as are the horned dinosaurs proper, although we could find an ancestor or two in the Jurassic. So these dinosaur groups, they came late in the age of dinosaurs, and then they evolved slowly over time. So some, at the last I had read, Heterodontosaurus from the Jurassic period seemed to have some thickening here, perhaps connecting it to this group of horned dinosaurs and/or Pachycephalosaurs. Heterodontosaurus is of interest because it had different kinds of teeth. In addition to the teeth up front, which the later ornithischian groups would lose, it had chewing teeth here, but it also then had tusk-like canines. Now they weren't canines; only mammals are recognized to have true canines. But then as we go through these dinosaurs, which I'm going to mention, the horned dinosaur like Triceratops, that animal wasn't around in the Triassic, nor in the Jurassic, nor in the early Cretaceous. So the ceratopsians that we think of, they only existed at the very end of the age of dinosaurs. And they were preceded by transitional fossils, by forms which were small, bipedal, and which had some, but not all, of the features of the advanced ceratopsians. So ceratopsian complexity developed over a long period of time through a series of intermediate stages. So if you were to start off with, early skulls, once again, Eoraptor, being an early dinosaur. If we were to convert that into an early ornithischian dinosaur, we would have to add a predentary bone and a little bone over the eye. Heterodontosaurus, as I had mentioned, a slightly different skull in that, there are some tooth modifications. And then by the time we get to this individual known as Yinlang, this is recognized as an ancestor of the horned dinosaurs. It was a small bipedal animal in the Jurassic period. It still had teeth in the upper jaw, and which the later members would lose. It did not yet have the dental battery, which would be so effective in the later members. And so here we can see, a transitional form, small bipedal with some of the features that would come next. Jumping forward then in time, by the early Cretaceous, there was a group of dinosaurs known as the Psittacosaurs in Asia. Their name literally means the parrot lizard, because parrot beaks are quite thick. And when we look at the skull of these dinosaurs, they were developing, an extremely and unusually thick set of jaws. This was probably going along with the herbivory that they were practicing, because although we often think of the horned dinosaurs, with terms of their frills and the horns, one of the other adaptations, which I'll be emphasizing, is that they were very good at eating plants. They had made modifications to make them very good at eating plants. So their success might have been, in part due to their horns and frills, but also how efficient they were at obtaining energy from plants should also be considered. And so Psittacosaurus had a parrot-like beak. This region here was thickened, obviously not forming a frill yet, but there was, some, beginnings of skull thickenings, arguably laying the foundation for what would come later. Their beaks were toothless, but they were beginning to specialize these cheek teeth for herbivory. Now, while they didn't have horns proper, I know this is perhaps a little harder to see, but if one were to consider this region of the skull, like the temporal region, the squamosal region of the temporal bone, there was actually a projection there which was pointed, which could be considered a horn, just not a traditional horn coming out, say from the frontal area, but more than from the sides of the skull. Now, you might say, who cares? But if we could go then back to the, say, Triceratops, et cetera, they also possessed that. So Psittacosaurus in the thickenings here in the projection in the squamosal region in the shape of the snout, this parrot-like shape, getting thicker for eating plants. It is showing itself with some of the skull features which would mark the later horned dinosaurs. The Psittacosaurs were actually quite diverse. And so here I'm going to illustrate just some of the members of this group. And then the last I had heard that if you look at the number of species which are attributed to the genus Psittacosaurus. So Psittacosaurus would be the genus name. So here I'll just abbreviate that with a P, and then add the species name, that this was the most diverse genus of dinosaurs that I had heard, that more species were attributed to this genus than to any others. So it was successful. And we can see that there was some variation. They had this parrot-like beak, but then there were some, thickenings of the skull, perhaps even, a small horn in some, showing that once you started down this route, that variation could then include, variation in the horn, that skull feature. Okay. And so then just quickly, so once again, so here's that projection here that I was mentioning, even on Triceratops. If you were to look, say, on Protoceratops, the group which I will, talk about presently, it's not as pronounced as it was in Psittacosaurus. So in Psittacosaurus, this region of the skull really did project, I don't know if you want to call it a horn, but a pointed projection that might be used in defense to some degree, and the later horned dinosaurs would still retain that feature, just not to the same degree. And so Psittacosaurs, here you can see in the New York City Museum of Natural History, that projection I was mentioning here, that thickened beak. They were herbivores. Here's an interesting thing, that many herbivores can eat stones to grind their food, which can then become gastroliths. That's pointed out here. Horned dinosaurs eating plants was obviously something very important. Just one other thing, I'll mention it again in a second. The frill, in later groups will form here, but I do want to point out that this is where the jaw muscles go. Because I do want to mention chewing as we progress. Okay, so after the Psittacosaurs of the early Cretaceous, there was another group that was intermediate between the Psittacosaurs and the horned ceratopsians, with which we are so familiar. If you wanted to give the group a name, you could call them the Protoceratopsians, although perhaps we could break them into more distinct groups, but let's just call them the Protoceratopsians as a group. So from Psittacosaurus, then other animals got to be a little bit larger. Notice that they have this parrot-like beak, and they start to specialize their teeth. By the time you get to the horned dinosaurs, like Triceratops, you have a dental battery, which is very good at slicing food. So they're going in that direction. They're going in, the direction of having a huge head. That's a really big head compared to the rest of the animal. And when we go back to Triceratops, just the size of the head is enormous. So the head is getting bigger, the snout is getting wider, and here we have teeth which are adapting to eating plants, and the muscles of the lower jaw, note that they come through these holes, and they can then attach on the frill. So the frill can certainly serve as defense. But if your jaw muscles don't have to end here, if they can go here, if they can go up here, you have an incredibly powerful bite. This group is getting better at eating tough, fibrous material, which was good because in the Cretaceous, among other things, there was a group of gymnosperms which was spreading, known as the cycads. They are still alive today. They have incredibly thick leaves. And so probably very few animals on Earth could eat cycad leaves. But if you're getting, teeth which are very good at slicing, and you're getting long jaw muscles, which are actually attaching on this frill, then potentially one of the reasons for your success is there's a plant, source on Earth, which is common, that only you could eat. Obviously, that's a winning combination. So if you were to look at this skull, it's not a Triceratops skull yet, nor was the previous one Leptoceratops. So you didn't see as big a frill, but you did see a small frill, all right? Most of these did not have horns, but a couple of them did. Some were bipedal, as you'll see. And so these are transitional fossils. It's not Triceratops, but you have animals which have some, but not all of those features. So the modified features that we associate with those horned dinosaurs, they evolved in steps. So if you started off with the small bipedal first dinosaurs that become the small bipedal ornithischians. Then by the time you get to forms like Psittacosaurus, once again, still bipedal, although probably capable, of going down and, being quadrupedal as well. From that then come a variety of these Protoceratopsians. Now, once again, the earliest ones would be probably all bipedal, or that would be the predominant form of their locomotion. Then there would be some which could arguably be both, all right, so that they could be both quadrupedal and bipedal. Perhaps, certain times walking upright was better or standing to reach higher leaves. But then as they became larger animals, they became more top heavy and then became quadrupedal. So here one can see that, the gait does not have to be bipedal or quadrupedal, that you can have intermediate stages. And then within these Protoceratopsians, in say the early to mid Cretaceous, you have animals which are bipedal, which are quadrupedal, and also intermediate and then capable of both forms of locomotion. These Protoceratopsians were successful. The greatest diversity is known in Asia, but they spread throughout the world. The sizes of their frills vary. Some are small, or arguably close to non-existent, while others, like Protoceratops, are quite significant. Some, such as Pachycephalosaurs, might have supported, some degree of a horn. There are bipedal forms like the early Microceratops with its small frill. There are ones which were capable of both bipedal and quadrupedal locomotion, like Leptoceratops, and then organisms like Protoceratops, which would be quadrupedal. Okay, and so the very specialized skulls which the horned dinosaurs possessed, these seem to have evolved in stages. Yinlong has some steps towards that form. Psittacosaurus has a few more. And among the Protoceratopsians, you can find a few more, including some with, arguably sporting small horns, some with small frills, intermediate frills, and then even large frills, as in Protoceratops. Now, the horned dinosaurs, which I'll discuss in a second, would then add to this large frill and then add prominent brow horns and or a nasal horn. Before getting to that, just once again to touch on some of the Protoceratopsians, one could see that they adapted to this lifestyle gradually. So if you were to just look at their hands started off as being, thin and rather dexterous, because the early members were bipedal or largely bipedal. But then by the end, Protoceratops and certainly the horned dinosaurs, their hands became thicker and arguably then had thickenings at the distal ends, supporting perhaps hooves, because they were bearing the body's weight. Once again, this is a big head for these animals. Microceratops is considered to be a primitive member of the group. Notice its head is smaller. It only has a small horn, and there are a variety of forms known here. Protoceratops is a famous dinosaur. In the early 1900s, there was a gentleman who had the hypothesis that early humans originated in Asia rather than Africa. So he went out to Asia in large part to search for these humans. Now, he was wrong, but he did, in digging for fossils in places which others had not, such as in Mongolia. He found all of these great fossils, like the first velociraptor and Protoceratops. Now, he found so many Protoceratops skeletons that he was able to notice something that people hadn't observed before. So, for example, not only did he find eggs, all right, and the nests of dinosaurs. This was the first time, the reproduction of dinosaurs was known. He also noted there seems to be a gender difference here. Now, dinosaurs originally were considered essentially to be big dumb lizards. But the more that they were discovered, there were hints of social groupings and traveling in groups or nesting together, and this did not fit the model based just on, say, lizards. And so our notion of dinosaurs changed over time, and things like the discovery of Protoceratops helped. So for the first time, one could construct the life history of a dinosaur. And so Protoceratops for a while was the best understood dinosaur. It was known how they reproduced, how they matured, whether there was a gender difference at the end. And so Protoceratops has a special place in dinosaur history. Now we understand many dinosaurs well, but you go back to the early 1900s, Protoceratops was arguably the best understood dinosaur. And then a lot of what we then hypothesized about dinosaurs stemmed from those discoveries of Protoceratops. Once again, notice how big the heads are. Notice that here's that projection in this temporal region, harking back to Psittacosaurus. Notice that this is an ornithischian. You see the hip projecting backwards. And then notice that the frill did not have to be solid bone, and then could allow, in addition to protection, it could allow the attachment of muscles. Okay, and so then advanced forms like the ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs, these are only known from the end of the age of dinosaurs, from the Cretaceous. This is significant for a number of reasons. The dinosaurs were still diversifying and producing new lineages at the end of the Mesozoic. And so if one were, to argue that did they go out with a whimper? I mean, were, they essentially all dying at the end? Well, one can't make that argument. The ornithopods, the hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, they were certainly diversifying, an explosion in diversity at the end of the Cretaceous, as were the horned dinosaurs. If one were to argue, well, as flowering plants, became dominant plants, were they causing the extinction of the dinosaurs? Well, the answer would be, well, apparently no, because some of the plant-eating dinosaurs, the horned dinosaurs and the duck-billed dinosaurs, which ate these plants, they were doing great, if anything. And so there were lots of different kinds of these horned dinosaurs. So obviously they are known for being large quadrupedal animals, although some were smaller than others. They had this frill. Now the frill could not only serve a role in protection, but once again the jaw muscles could then go through the holes at the top of the head and then project here. And so, therefore, these animals had an extremely powerful bite. And once again, very fibrous leaves like the cycads, they might have been something that only these horned dinosaurs were capable of feeding on. When it comes to the defensive horns, there was certainly great variation. I mean, there could even be little hornlets from the sides of the frill, as you can see in many groups. One of the subfamily, so once again, a family, its Latin name would end in DAE, so Ceratopsidae would be the horned dinosaurs, but we could split that into subfamilies. And in one of the subfamilies, Ceratopsinae, the trend is, there are exceptions, but the trend is that the horns over the brow, they are the larger horns, and then the nasal horn, that's the smaller horn. And so Ceratopsinae certainly had a great deal of diversity here. These are all genera names, so there would have been even more different kinds of species. And then there was another subfamily, the Centrosaurinae, in which it was not the brow horns over the eye, which tended to be the largest, but rather the nasal horn. And so these skulls seem to have adapted, to these large frills in stages. Zuniceratops, last I heard, was the most primitive known horned dinosaurs. But then some lineages de-emphasize the brow horns in favor of a very prominent nasal horn. And then, so here is a subfamily of the horned dinosaurs, also quite diverse. So from it, once again, last I checked, Zuniceratops seems to be close to the ancestry of it. But in this group, although there are certainly diversity, some have prominent horns or hornlets attached to the frills. Some do have brow horns. Nevertheless, the trend in this group was to have very large nasal horns, or in Pachycephalosaurs, this case, just a big nasal, bump of bone that might have attached, some, for a structure made of keratin in the in life. Now, before I go to some images, just for teaching my classes, to help people remember, I made a video of Avengosaurs, where I just try to emphasize how different dinosaurs defended themselves. And so you have, some armored dinosaurs like stegosaurs with their, plates of bone and the spikes on their tail. You have the ankylosaurs that have a suit of, armor, a complete casing, in addition to having, say, a clubbed tail. There are the Pachycephalosaurs with their domes of skull, with their domes of bone on the skull, which could be used in ramming. There are, the sauropods with their large size, obviously, which could, be used in their defense. But then obviously the large frill, helped, potentially to defend their neck region from a predator, and then also the variety of horns that they had. So if, that silly, little video helps you remember how different dinosaurs defended themselves, then great. Once again, that this frill could be solid bone, or it could have had spaces as well. So once again, that was an enormously heavy head. Some had necks with fused vertebrae, which would help them to hold up this head. But certainly any way of lightening it, such as potentially putting holes there, would be an advantage. Now, if you could cut away the snout and look at the teeth, they also had a dental battery where they had row upon row of cheek teeth which were fused together. Now, these teeth did not form a grinding platform the way that, say, the duck-billed dinosaurs do. So they did not grind their food, but rather sliced their food. And once again, the cycads, which were very fibrous, woody leaves, perhaps that was, an adaptation for feeding on tougher material that most animals couldn't. So most herbivores would have been unable to feed on that tough fibrous material. But between this dental battery of slicing teeth and these large jaw muscles, which could project to the frill, this, would give them, great adaptations for feeding. So there's, quite a great diversity in these skulls. And if you were to go to museums of natural history, you could observe, the great diversity in the different kinds of horned dinosaurs. All right, so, once again, some had a prominent nasal horn. Others had more prominent brow horns. Some were larger than others. Some could have horns off of the frill. This one, it's horn face downwards. I'm not sure it's understood why. Perhaps perhaps for burrowing, that might have had a role. Pachyrhinosaurus, not necessarily technically a horn, but more of just a big nasal boss that might have supported, some sort of a structure in life. And then Styracosaurus, which was here somewhere. Oh yeah, and then so Styracosaurus, in addition to its big nasal horn, obviously there could be horns on the frill itself, and in some more prominent than others. So this is an important group of dinosaurs. But also one of the interesting things is just how this very specialized body form developed in stages, all right, over tens of millions of years, dating back to things like Yinlong, or perhaps even Heterodontosaurus in the Jurassic period through the Psittacosaurs of the early Cretaceous to the Protoceratopsians in the mid-Cretaceous before getting to these big ceratopsian quadrupedal horn dinosaurs by the late Cretaceous. You know, it helps us understand that dinosaurs were still diversifying towards the end, in which when we talk about the end of the dinosaurs, you know, is an important question which we return to.